So basically, the Romantic period, predominantly, it is kind of a period in English history. In England, it ranges between 1785 to 1832. And the major poets of the Romantic period are William Wordsworth, Samuel T. Coleridge, Lord Byron, Percy Shelley, and John Keats. So William Wordsworth's poetry is famous because of its focus on nature. So it's a unique kind of romantic poetry in which William Wordsworth privileges the natural manifestations as the source of pleasure. He seems to say that while with industrialization, human beings are becoming more and more mechanical, it is very important that we stay in touch with the nature as well, because nature is not only source of pleasure, but according to him, nature is source of enlightenment as well. Nature is a guide, in his words. Nature is a teacher, in his words. Therefore, we learn a lot from nature, right? Some people and some critics call him a pantheist, right? So a pantheist is a person who kind of worships nature, who believes that God exists in nature, right? So many poems by him are famous. Some of you might have read his Daffodils, which is a very famous poem by William Wordsworth. S.T. Coleridge, the second poet over here, he is famous for the supernatural element in his poetry. Coleridge was recognized as one of the literary critics of romantic poetry as well. So was William Wordsworth too, right? So Coleridge wrote a lot about the role of human imagination, and he was of the view that in order to understand literature, we need to understand how our imagination works. Lord Byron, his romantic poetry, is common poetry about human emotions. I mean, it's not common in the sense that everybody could write it, but common in the sense that he expressed those emotions which are common to us all. Shelley also had a lot of supernatural element in his poetry. John Keats was a highly sensuous poet. He believed that sensuousness, right, the ability to perceive through senses, is the ultimate pleasure. For example, sense of touch, sense of sight, sense of smell, right? So these are senses that we all have. If somebody believes that ultimate pleasure in this world depends on the perceptions through these five senses, then we say that that person is sensuous in his approach, right? So therefore his poetry is said to be highly sensuous poetry because it privileges the human senses over other sources of pleasure. Are there other sources of pleasure as well? Yes. For example, William Wordsworth, right, the first poet in the list, he believed in the inner vision, right? An inner vision, an inner vision based upon imagination. Same was case with S.T. Coleridge. However, John Keats believed in the pleasure perceived through five senses. Okay. For example, there needs to be a beautiful sight which we can perceive through our eyes, Okay, so if there is no beautiful sight out there, then no inward pleasure is possible for John Keats. However, William Wordsworth argued that it's not the William Wordsworth's view was that it's not the physical beauty in front of us. For example, it is not the beautiful lake in front of us which is sufficient to cause pleasure. Rather, according to William Wordsworth, it is the memory, right? It is the memory of a beautiful view. It's the memory of a beautiful lake at a later stage that brings us pleasure. So that way, William Wordsworth was more of a visionary poet, while John Keats was more of a sensuous poet. Now, there are some characteristics to romantic poetry. First of all, of course, sensuousness. John Keats was the most famous poet for that. So this is a famous quote by him: "Beauty is truth, beauty, that is all." So basically his argument, not exactly argument, but his view of the poetry and of the world was this, that uh, that the concrete beauty, in front of us in the world, concrete beauty is the uh, ultimate truth, right? So he did not believe in the logical, rational truth. For him, the only truth was the beauty that we can see outside, right? So the beauty in all of its forms, the beauty in the form of art, the beauty in the form of nature, uh, and the beauty in the form of, night sky. Uh, so for him, the beautiful sights outside, they contain the ultimate truth. And that is the only truth that we can see. I think I'll just keep admitting people. Okay, so the second characteristic of romantic poetry is imagination. Okay, we discussed this characteristic in as a general characteristic in literature in our first 2-3 classes, right? So I hope most of you understand the concept of imagination, right? So imagination is opposite to rationality, right? So uh, sometimes we think in very objective and rational terms. So when we think in rational and objective terms, basically we do not allow imagination to take over our mind. On the other hand, imagination is something which is free flowing, right? So ideas come to in our mind and they go away on their own without our control on them. That is imagination, right? Now, the romantic poets had a very, different view of human development, human progress, right? So, generally speaking, we all appreciate objectivity and rationality, right? And we think that it is the rationality and it is objectivity which is the ultimate, success for all of us, for all the human beings. The romantic poet, on the other hand, had a different view, and they argued that it is the imagination which is the primary, element of human mind. And their view was that imagination is more important than rationality, because imagination makes creativity possible, right? While rationalism kills the creativity, right? Therefore, these romantic poets, they not only practiced, free play of imagination, rather they, spread the message of the importance of imagination, right? So when we read a poem, for example, which is totally product of the imagination of a particular poet, in fact, the poet is trying to demonstrate that the product of his or her imagination is superior to any manufactured or any scientific or any mechanically produced product. Why? Because while the poet exercised her or his imagination to write a poem, the poet uh, passed through many moments of pure pleasure and pure happiness, right? So creativity makes us happy. It gives us delight. It gives us comfort, right? So that is the ultimate beauty of the play of imagination. On the other hand, a mechanically produced product cannot cause and does not cause any happiness. So that is why the romantic poets admired imagination a lot, and they still admire imagination a lot. Aesthetics, we already discussed, is sense of beauty basically, right? It's very close to sensuousness in a sense, right? But it is a little different because aesthetics, so we all have five senses, right? But some of us might not have very sharp aesthetic sense, right? And some of us might have that, right? Well, majority of us, I would say, do have aesthetics. That is why we are in this course, Introduction to Literature. But generally speaking, the aesthetic sense is our ability to perceive beauty, or our ability to perceive harmony and order in the things around us. Romantic poetry has a very strong element of aesthetics as well, right? So aesthetics is the third characteristic of romantic poetry. The next characteristic of romantic poetry is solitude. So the romantic poets happen to be, in most of the cases, uh, people who preferred solitude, right, over uh, mixing in the crowds, or over company, in very simple words, right? But then there is another view of solitude. People say that solitude does not necessarily mean that you have to be all alone all the time and you do not talk to anybody or you do not mix with people. Rather, solitude actually means that you think individually. uh, Let me rephrase myself. We think individualistically, right? So solitude is a state of mind that some of us are able to impose on ourselves, right? Where even if we are standing in a crowd, or we are standing with other people, or we are standing in public, still we are able to maintain our psychological distance from the other people, right? So the people who can maintain certain degree of solitude in their personality, they are not easily influenced by the mainstream thinking. Rather, they seem to have a unique viewpoint about everything around them, about the life, about the world. Therefore, solitude is a very unique feature of romantic poetry as well, and it is found in romantic poets. And the reason for that is that romantic poets are usually people of strong subjectivity. They have strong subjective beliefs, and they not only stick to those subjective beliefs, but they express those subjective beliefs in their writing. Therefore, most of the romantic poets essentially prefer solitude. Or, in other words, they essentially impose solitude among themselves. So, there is a famous example of another poet who is also said to be a romantic poet. He is kind of, a poet who came very late in history as far as the romantic period is concerned, W.B. Yeats, who was an Irish poet. So, he, for example, used to say that, and he practiced that too, that a poet is the one who creates for himself, a tower, right? A tower, and sits, in the top story of the tower, right? So that is a kind of symbol, right? Tower is a kind of symbol that if you have a tower built and you kind of uh, have staircase from the ground until the top, and you climb all those stairs, you reach to the top of the tower, and you have a small maybe study room built over there. You sit inside it, and then sitting over there, you write your poetry. Okay, so the idea is that a poet is a person who is elevated from the ground, who is elevated, who is above the ground. One thing. And the second thing is, the poet is a person who can look at the world from their unique perspective, right? So when you are high on the upper floor of a tower, you not only are elevated from the rest of the world, but also you are able to look at the world from your unique perspective, because everybody else is on the ground equal to each other, but you are the one elevated and therefore able to see at the world from your own perspective, right? So that is solitude in romantic poetry. The next feature of romantic poetry is exoticism, right? So exoticism is, the element of foreignness, the element of foreignness in poetry. Foreignness in the sense that something which does not belong to this world, right, is represented in poetry. So that is called an exotic element in poetry. Generally speaking, generally speaking, an English poet, if an English poet represents any element of uh, non-English culture. For example, a British poet represents, uh, you know, an African cave in their poetry, then that will be an exotic element in the poetry, because you will not find an African cave in the British culture, right? So I'm sure you have heard the word exotic and you know what does it mean, right? So exotic is something that comes from other culture, different culture. So poetry, maintains lot of and includes lot of exotic elements. Romantic poetry, especially, brings in lot of exotic elements. Finally, supernaturalism. So because the poets depend too much on imagination, therefore it's very common in poetry to have supernatural element. So there could be, elves and jinns and fairies and you know other supernatural beings in the poetry. Also, there in the romantic poetry there could be supernatural happenings too, right? So for example, there could be sorry about that. Okay, I just removed him. Okay, so the supernatural element can include souls, human souls, meeting in the heaven, right? Uh, or they might include, uh, you know, uh, as I previously mentioned, fairies or elves or heaven, right? The representation of heaven. In some cases, representation of hell as well, right? So depending upon the subject matter of a particular poem. Okay, so before I move on, let me share with you a poem which is over here. So students, this is a romantic poem by a romantic poet, S.T. Coleridge. His name is there on the first slide too. Okay, so the title of poem is Kubla, and subtitle you may call it, or a vision in a dream, a fragment, right? So I'll just read these lines, these many, just to make sense of what does romantic poetry look like. So the lines go like this: in Xanadu did Kubla a stately prior dome decree, where Elf, the sacred river, ran through caverns measureless to man, down to a sunless sea. Right? So, right from the first word. Now, remember, this is a British poet. Okay, look at the first line. Right? So, Kubla Khan, this name Khan. Right? I hope you most will agree. I hope you can see the poem, right, students? Can you confirm?
Yes, sir.
Yes,
Good.
sir.
Okay.
Yes,
Now,
sir.
Kubla, you look at the this name Kubla Khan. What does it sound like? Does it sound like a British name, or does it look like uh, an exotic name for the British people?
Yes, sir.
Right? It looks like an exotic name for the British people, right? It is 1600, sorry, 1800, right? It's beginning of 19th century, right? It's like 200 years ago when this poem was written, right? There was not a lot of international travel, and people didn't know each other across the continents, right? It is that time when the poem was written, right? So definitely Kubla Khan did not know about Imran Khan or anybody from who had this last name Khan with it, right? There was no means of the long distance communication and transmission and all that. So that was the time when the poem was written. So the poet is beginning the poem with this line, in Xanadu did Kubla Khan. Now the word Xanadu itself is name of a dreamland, and this place is in the mythical, right, in the mythical traditions. This place Xanadu, it is related with China. It is related with China, right? So you can well imagine what the poet is thinking at this moment of time, right? The poet is thinking at this moment of time of the East, generally speaking, the East, as he knows about the East from the books or travelogues that the poet has been reading. Okay, so he at the beginning of the poem is referring to a place in China, and is mentioning somebody, Kubla Khan, who ordered to build a player dome, a palace. Where? In China, in some part of China, right? And the name of that individual is Kubla Khan. Now, if Kubla Khan ordered to build a palace, a stately palace, that clearly means that Kubla Khan is a king, right? He's a ruler. Let's continue with the third line. It says, where Elf, the sacred river, ran through caverns mirrorless to man, down to a sunless sea. Right now, the sacred river. I'm sure you uh, have heard about various myths about the river. That there are certain rivers who want a sacrifice of an individual from a particular community, right? And so every year, one person or two people, they are kind of get drowned, the one way or the other get drowned in the river, right? So that is a way for the river to accept the sacrifice, and that is how the river just continues, right? So in the mythical world, right, uh, there is always an idea of a sacred river, right? So the poet is referring to that kind of river, and it runs through caverns, right? Uh, which are measureless to man. They are so huge caverns, kind of cleavages, and it goes to a sunless sea, right? And then finally it ends on a sea which is too big uh, to be encompassed by the sun. It is outside the range of the sunlight, right? So you can imagine the kind of picture that the poet has created in the first stanza, right? It is an exotic picture, right? And to some extent, it is a supernatural picture because the way he's referring to the sacred river, that is a supernatural idea of the river, that the river accepts a sacrifice and therefore it is a sacred river. I mean, when you call something sacred, that naturally means that adding any, you are adding some supernatural value to that thing. All right. So, for example, if Holy Script is sacred, that means Holy Script has supernatural value. It can be attributed to the supernatural world, the world of divine, right? So if we continue to read these lines over here, they say, so twice 5 miles of fertile ground with walls and towers were girdled around, and there were gardens bright with sinuous rills where blossomed many an incense-bearing tree. And here were forests ancient as the hills, enfolding sunny spots of greenery. So he continues with that depiction of that kind of palace, which is surrounded by fertile ground, right, and which is surrounded by not on which is surrounded by the tall trees, right, and those trees produce incense, beautiful fragrance. And then around, so there is a fertile ground around the palace, right, and uh, and still around that fertile ground there were sinuous rills. Sinuous rills are the small water sources, right, small, very small lakes. And even around them, in another circle, there are tall trees, right, and even around those tall trees there are very high there are huge forests, right. So this is a whole imagery, of a stately palace, right, and along that palace there is huge river. And then that palace is surrounded by the fertile ground and very tall trees, and those trees produce beautiful smell, right. So this whole scene, if you capture it, number one, it is highly exotic. Number two, there is some supernatural element. In fact, if we read down the poem, there are even more supernatural elements in the poem, right. But I will also like you to notice over here the aesthetic element, right. So the aesthetic element in the poem lies in the fact that the scene that the poet has created, I hope you agree with that, it's a beautiful scene. I mean, just using a very basic expression, beautiful, for the time being, it's a beautiful scene, right. So this kind of palace, which has been depicted over here, right, with this extraordinary river along with it, and fertile beautiful ground and trees surrounding it, and in such a manner that the trees are producing beautiful fragrance, and still there is sunlight which is filtering through the trees and falling on the fertile ground. So the whole scene is aesthetically appealing, right. So the features of poetry that we discuss, we can see them very clearly in the very first stanza. So we do notice the sensuousness over here, the role of imagination, right. So I in fact mentioned Kubla Khan, right, with imagination. So this whole poem uh, is a total product of imagination, right. The poet might have read about these things somewhere, might have read, right, but the poet has never traveled to China, right. Therefore, whatever we see over here, he is the product of his imagination, right. Some people also tell that while Lester College wrote this poem, he was under some kind of uh, substance induced trance, right. So we are not trying to kind of um, kind of uh, appreciate the use of any substance, but just to give you an idea that there is so much dependence uh, on the imagination. And aesthetics is clearly there, right. It's aesthetically produced scene. Do you see solitude over here? Yes, there is definitely solitude in the poem. So the scene that we just read, okay, itself stands apart from the rest of the world. It seems to be somewhere where nobody else is. It seems to be away from the, day-to-day hustle and bustle of life, right? So the whole scene stands in solitude in its own self. But additionally, the poem, or at least the lines we have read, they also demonstrate the state of solitude that overpowers the poet's own mind, right? So your mind needs to be in that state of solitude and independence in order to produce this kind of unique imagination, as Coleridge has produced in the poem Kubla Khan, right? Exoticism is clearly there. We already discussed that, because the setting of the poem is in China. So with reference to the British audience, this is an exotic setting, right? And there is supernatural element in the poem as well. There is more supernatural element if you read down, further stanzas in the poem. Okay, so this was about British Romantic period. Now, along with that, there is some element of romantic poetry in America as well, although it is not that strong as it is in Britain, right? So British Romantic poetry, of course, is much more celebrated and recognized, and is much more in volume uh, as compared to the Romantic literature in America. So basically, in America, the Romantic period is so totally different, right? So two of the main authors who are basically not poets as such, Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. So they were directly influenced by William Wordsworth and S.T. Coleridge, the two British poets. We already have discussed transcendentalism in America, and I also mentioned these two authors at that time as well, right? So in America, romanticism emerged as transcendentalism, right? So this word transcendentalism is very important. So basically, the word transcend means when you go above and beyond the physical life that we live. And transcendentalists are those who believe in the life above this material life, right? Who believe in a kind of metaphysical life. All right. So Emerson and Thoreau, both of them, they were transcendentalists because they believed in not just the physical life, but they believed in the existence of metaphysical life as well, right? So this belief in transcendentalism was heavily influenced by William Wordsworth and S.T. Coleridge in Britain. Okay, so this is the kind of romantic period that we see in America. There is no romantic movement, right? In England, there was a proper romantic movement with all these poets as parts of that movement. But in Britain, in America, there was no romantic movement as such. All right.